Hollywood crowns kings in velvet robes, feeds them roasted swans, and locks them in palaces dripping with gold. The truth? Medieval kings lived lives far rougher than the movies suggest. Their castles were freezing fortresses, their food plain and often spoiled, their hygiene appalling, and their power endlessly fragile. Behind the glamour of crowns and swords was a daily grind of discomfort, bureaucracy, and danger. Here's what medieval kings really faced. Movies present castles as glittering halls of wealth, but they were military strongholds first and foremost. Their massive stone walls trapped dampness and cold, making most interiors dark, smoky, and uncomfortable. Even roaring fireplaces couldn't heat the cavernous spaces, leaving kings huddling under furs at night. Windows were narrow arrow slits designed for defense, not light, so rooms remained dim even at midday. Privacy barely existed. A king was constantly surrounded by advisors, servants, and guards, with business sometimes conducted in the bedchamber itself. Furniture was heavy and sparse, benches, trestle tables, and the occasional canopy bed stuffed with straw or feathers. The walls were hung with tapestries, less for beauty than to block icy drafts. Bathrooms were primitive. Kings used garderobes, stone chambers with a hole dropping waste into pits, or chamber pots emptied by attendants. The stench of waste often clung to entire castles, adding to the mix of smoke, sweat, and animals. Castles were never quiet. They rang with the sounds of smiths hammering, livestock moving, courtiers talking, and soldiers drilling. The air carried the smells of cooking fires, manure, and unwashed bodies. These were not palaces of elegance, but crowded, smelly, bustling fortresses, where survival mattered more than comfort. For a king, the castle was a symbol of authority and defense, but as a home, it was cold, noisy, and often miserable. Grand banquets in movies show kings dining on endless platters of swan, venison, and wine. Reality was far plainer. Daily meals for kings revolved around staples: bread, cheese, and pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat. Meat was eaten more often than by peasants, but preservation was limited. Salting, smoking, or pickling helped, yet spoiled food still found its way to the table, often disguised with sauces. Spices were a luxury imported from far-off lands. While kings could afford them, they weren't sprinkled lavishly on everyday meals. They appeared most during ceremonial feasts, where meals doubled as political theatre to impress nobles and foreign dignitaries. Elaborate sugar sculptures or exotic animals might grace the table, but these were rare displays, not normal dining. Another problem was heat. Kitchens were built separately from halls to reduce fire risk, meaning food arrived cold or lukewarm after long journeys through corridors. Even kings dealt with disappointing meals, sometimes risking food poisoning. Alcohol was safer than water, so kings drank ale and wine regularly, often diluted. Sweetened drinks like mead or imported wines appeared occasionally, but weren't everyday fare. Fruits and vegetables were eaten in season and dried or preserved when possible, but availability was inconsistent. Compared to peasants, kings ate more variety, more meat, and more imported goods. Yet the idea of nightly feasts is pure fantasy. Most of the time, meals were functional, closer to filling fuel than extravagant indulgence, just served with more ceremony and better tableware. Crowned heads did not mean clean bodies. Kings rarely bathed, sometimes only a few times a year, soaking in wooden tubs filled with hot water. Soap was scarce, and herbal concoctions or rough cloth scrubbing took its place. Linen undergarments were believed to absorb dirt, so frequent changes of clothes were seen as a substitute for bathing. The result was lice, fleas, and strong odours that no crown could disguise. Toilets were equally primitive. Chamber pots stood in bedrooms, emptied daily by servants. Garderobes, stone closets built into castle walls, let waste drop into pits or running water, but they smelled foul and often leaked into nearby areas. Entire castles could reek of human waste, and diseases linked to poor sanitation were common. Dental care was rudimentary. Toothbrushes were unknown in most of Europe, so kings used cloth, twigs, or herbs to rub teeth. Bad breath and tooth decay were widespread, even among royalty. Perfumed gloves, flowers, or scented oils were carried to mask unpleasant odours. Health risks were constant. Contaminated wells, filthy living conditions, and poor medical knowledge meant infections and parasites thrived. Even kings were vulnerable to epidemics like dysentery or plague. Royal physicians relied on bloodletting, charms, and herbal remedies with little scientific basis. The image of a perfumed, perfectly groomed king is pure fiction. In reality, kings lived in environments where filth and disease were constant companions. Wealth bought fine clothes and perfumes, but not true cleanliness or safety from illness. Movies love the idea of kings making bold declarations and leading armies in person, but much of kingship was paperwork and negotiation. Kings spent endless hours hearing disputes, signing charters, overseeing taxes, and issuing decrees. Many weren't fully literate, so scribes and clerks handled the writing while the king applied seals for legitimacy. Ruling was administration, not constant drama. Travel was another burden. Kings rarely stayed in one castle for long. They moved across their territories to enforce authority, collect rents, and resolve disputes in person. These progresses weren't leisure trips, they were grueling journeys along muddy roads with entire courts in tow to ensure no region slipped from control. Court life was crowded with barons, bishops, and courtiers petitioning for favours. Managing nobles was often harder than defeating enemies. One angry lord could spark rebellion. Kings had to balance rewards and punishments carefully, constantly calculating loyalty. War wasn't just knights charging heroically. For kings, it meant endless planning, raising taxes, hiring mercenaries, feeding armies, and negotiating alliances. Campaigns drained treasuries and forced kings into debt with bankers or nobles. Being king was less about absolute power and more about constant management of fragile systems. Every tax, judgment, or appointment risked backlash. Far from glamorous, rulership was exhausting administration with little rest. Behind the throne was a mountain of scrolls, disputes, and compromises, all demanding the king's attention daily. The crown looked like the ultimate prize, but in reality, it was a constant liability. A medieval king's authority was never secure. Every decision risked sparking rebellion, and rivals waited for the slightest sign of weakness. Unlike the image of an all-powerful monarch, a king's rule was fragile, balanced on shifting alliances, military strength, and political calculation. Even family ties were unreliable. Brothers, cousins, and even sons sometimes challenged the king's authority. Dynasties regularly fractured because multiple heirs or rival claimants staked their rights to succession. Marriage was one of the few tools to secure alliances, but it often created new tensions. A childless marriage endangered a dynasty, while foreign marriages tied kingdoms to the politics of distant courts, dragging kings into conflicts not of their choosing. Assassination and betrayal were constant fears. Poisoning at feasts, ambushes during hunts, or treachery from trusted courtiers ended many reigns. Kings relied on food tasters, bodyguards, and constant vigilance, yet no precautions guaranteed safety. Paranoia was not a weakness, it was survival. The church was another powerful player. Excommunication could strip a king of legitimacy overnight. If declared outside the Christian community, his subjects were freed from loyalty. Several kings were forced to kneel before popes to regain recognition, proving that even crowns bowed to spiritual authority. Foreign powers exploited instability. Rival monarchs funded uprisings, supported claimants, or invaded directly when they sensed weakness. A king who lost a battle or treasury often saw his vassals defect to enemies, calculating survival over loyalty. War was as much about maintaining credibility as it was about winning land. The reality is that medieval kingship was precarious. Every crown was contested, every throne vulnerable. Power lasted only as long as a king could command loyalty, pay armies, and project strength. Behind the image of royal grandeur was a life spent guarding against revolt, betrayal, and collapse. Kings wore crowns not as symbols of security but as targets, constantly reminded that rule was temporary and survival never guaranteed. Medieval kings weren't the glamorous rulers of legend. They lived in cold, uncomfortable castles, ate simple food, endured poor hygiene, and worked endlessly to hold together fragile realms. Their crowns carried crushing responsibility and constant danger, not luxury. Behind the myths of power and grandeur was a daily reality defined by discomfort, administration, and survival. The truth about kingship isn't about glory, it's about the relentless struggle to endure in a brutal age.